In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful, and may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon His last and beloved Messenger Muhammad, and may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you all. The title of this episode is Understanding Material Behavior Under Load from the Quran. In this episode, brothers and sisters, I will show how to predict the response of a material under an applied load, and how to derive the curve showing this relationship between the force and displacement in the material completely from the last revelation of Allah God to people in the Noble Quran. Now, to do this, we need to know some basic knowledge from the Noble Quran. Firstly, that we know that the material is composed of atoms. So matter in creation, the matter is composed of atoms. Now Allah God Almighty teaches us in the Noble Quran the design of these atoms, such that Allah states in the Noble Quran in chapter 67 verse 3 the following: Who has created the seven heavens one above another, you can see no fault in the creations of the most beneficent. Then look again, can you see any rifts? So Allah God Almighty teaches us here that His methodology in creation, to create a central object surrounded by seven layers, seven heavens. So we have the earth surrounded by seven layers. Thus we can learn from this that the atom should be created the same methodology. Since there is only one creator, so it's the same methodology in creation, the same way. So we can learn from this that the atom should be composed of a central object surrounded by seven heavens. So from the Noble Quran we can learn that the atom is composed of a central object surrounded by seven heavens. Now also Allah God teaches us what is the energy in these heavens. What is the energy of the heaven of the atom? Where we can learn this from the Noble Quran, the last revelation of Allah God to people, from chapter 51 verse 7, which states, and the heaven containing weaved ropes. So Allah God Almighty teaches us here that the heaven contains weaved ropes. Now the heaven is any volume surrounding a central object. For example, the volume of the heaven of the earth is the volume surrounding the earth. The heaven of the atom is the volume surrounding the nucleus of the atom. So Allah states here that any heaven, it contains weaved ropes. So as you can see on the screen, this is the weaved rope, three strings weaved together. So Allah states that the heaven, let's say so whether it's the heaven of the earth or the heaven of the atom, it contains these weaved ropes, weaved strings. It's interesting to note that Allah used the word weaved ropes. Now we can learn from this that the function of ropes is to produce a pulling action on the objects on their ends. Now the function of any rope is to produce tension, a pulling action on the objects attached as ends. So since Allah God teaches us that there are ropes in the energy ropes within the heavens of the atom, this means that the nucleus will be on one side of these ropes, and on the other side will be the object that is brought in close proximity to the atom. So this means that if we bring two atoms in close proximity to each other, then the ropes of one atom will be attached to the ropes of the other atom, and thus the two nuclei will have ropes attached to them. So this explains atomic bonding. Once again, if we bring two atoms in close proximity to each other, the ropes, the energy ropes in one heaven will be linked to the energy ropes in the other atom, and thus a bond is created, and thus we have two nuclei, the nucleus, two nuclei attached with ropes, and this creates atomic bonding. So Allah teaches us that atomic bonding is created by ropes, energy ropes attached to each other. Now this is explained beautifully in the Noble Quran, where Allah states that connections, whether they are spiritual connections or material connections, they are created by a tight knot. They are created by a tight knot. So it's interesting to note here that Allah used the word knot, because knot is what's created when two ropes are attached to each other. So when two ropes are linked to each other, a knot is created. So Allah teaches that atomic bonding, that the atomic bond is created by an energy like knot between the weave drops of one atom attached to the weave drops of the other atom. The weave drops in the heaven of one atom attached to the weave drops in the heaven of another atom. Now, having understood this, now we come to derive the force displacement curve for a material under load. Now, suppose that we have a material subjected to a tensile force pulling it from its ends. So we have a material and there is a tensile force pulling it at its ends. We want to derive a curve. On the y-axis there is the force, and the x-axis there is the displacement. So how to derive this curve from the Noble Quran? Now, if we apply a certain force, let's say 100 Newton. Now, this force will pull the atoms away from each other. And since Allah teaches us that there are ropes between them, and thus the ropes act like springs between the atoms, and thus there will be a certain displacement in the material, indicated to by point number 1. Now, if these ropes are not broken, then if we apply double the force, 200 Newton, then the displacement will be doubled. Let's say, for example, in the 100 Newton, we have 100 micrometer displacement. If the force becomes 200 Newton, then the displacement will be doubled if there is no kind of breaking in the ropes. So that leaves us to figure number 1. Now after a certain magnitude of force, some of the ropes will be broken. Now suppose that we start with 100 ropes, for example, between the two nucleus. If we start with 100 ropes between the two atoms, 100 ropes. Now after a certain magnitude of force, some of these ropes will start to break. It's like a fabric being torn. So if we have like 80 ropes, then if we increase the force to 300 Newton, the same kind of increase in force, but at this time the material becomes weaker, and thus there will be a larger displacement. So for the same amount of increase in force, we have a larger displacement, and that's indicated to by point number 3. So point number 3, we see same increase in force, but a larger increase in displacement, because we have breaking of these weaved ropes connections between the two atoms. And point 4, again the ropes break more and more, and thus the material becomes weaker, and thus for the same increase in force we have a larger increase in displacement, and thus the curve becomes non-linear. So if we now connect a line between these points, we end up with the force displacement curve shown in the figure, and this is completely derived from the Noble Quran, such that the believer will be the teacher of others and not the one on the receiving end. So to summarize here, as we increase the force, if the weaved ropes connections, the tight knots, the weaved ropes between the two atoms are not broken, then there will be a linear change, a linear relationship between force and displacement. Now at a certain point in the curve, these weaved ropes connections will start to break. Like you have 100 springs, 20 are broken, so you have 80. So you have a reduced strength of the material, reduced stiffness, and thus the same increase in force now will yield a larger increase in displacement. And that's the end points, until a certain point in the material where all the weaved ropes connections are broken, and thus the material fractures. And that's point number 4, and we end up with the figure shown on the screen. Now, how to prove this from a scientific point of view? This is completely deduced from the Noble Quran. This is a prediction of what the force displacement curve will look like from the last revelation of Allah God to people in the Noble Quran. Now, how to prove this from a scientific point of view? Now, there is a very famous kind of technique called, and in this technique, a universal testing machine is used. Now, this machine has 2 jaws, and the material is placed between 2 jaws, and a pulling action is done to the specimen. So this universal testing machine applies a tensile force to a specimen, and the computer draws the force displacement curve. The computer gives you this curve we are looking for. Now the curve obtained from this machine, universal testing machine, is shown on the screen, and if we compare this curve obtained from experiments with the curve predicted from the Noble Quran, the last revelation of Allah got to people, we see a perfect match between the two. So there is a perfect match between the force displacement curve, the stress strain curve obtained from experiments, and the force displacement curve, the stress strain curve obtained from the Noble Quran, from the understanding of the Noble Quran. So we see, glory be to Allah God Almighty, how Allah teaches us all branches of knowledge from the Noble Quran. This is the miracle of the Quran in this day of age, such that the believer would be the teacher of others and not the one on the receiving end. And this will bring people closer to the Noble Quran, and that will be a way for them to be guided to the path of Allah God Almighty. And to know more details about these topics, please visit my website at www.quran-miracle.com, and you can email me at zaidquran@yahoo.com. And may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you all.